When we talk about medicine, we usually, focus on the wins, the cure, the recovery.
Hmm.
But today, we're going deep into something just as vital, maybe even more profound. How we provide comfort and dignity when the focus shifts away from cure.
Exactly. It's such a critical part of healthcare. Our sources today zero in on the concepts of care for patients at end of life. The whole idea shifts.
Yeah.
We're not trying to extend life at all costs anymore. The goal becomes ensuring what we call a peaceful death.
A peaceful death.
Yeah, one that's free from distress and suffering that we can actually avoid.
Yeah.
It's about quality, not just quantity, of remaining life.
That feels like a really important mission. So what's the absolute core concept driving all of this?
It all comes down to one priority concept: comfort. That's the foundation. And supporting that, we've got three key interrelated concepts that kind of frame everything: cognition, perfusion, and ethics.
Okay. Comfort, cognition, perfusion, ethics. Got it.
You'll see how they weave through everything from managing pain to dealing with the legal aspects.
Okay, let's start with the basic structure, because I think even healthcare folks sometimes get confused. Palliative care versus hospice. What's the real difference there?
Yeah, that's a common point of confusion. It really boils down to the intent and the timing. Palliative care is more of a philosophy, right? It's total supportive care focused on quality of life. And importantly, it can happen at the same time as curative treatments.
Ah, okay. So you could be getting chemo and palliative care.
Absolutely. There's no time limit. The goal is just improving life quality, whatever the prognosis or treatment plan.
But hospice is different then. That feels like a more defined stage.
It is. Hospice care is specifically for the terminal phase. For Medicare coverage, usually the prognosis needs to be 6 months or less. And crucially, the patient has to agree to stop curative treatments for that specific terminal illness.
So that's a major shift in focus.
Yeah.
No longer trying to fix the underlying disease.
Right. It's purely about comfort, symptom management, and support for the patient and family.
And the evidence actually shows that getting palliative care involved earlier makes a big difference, doesn't it? It's not just a last-minute thing.
Oh, absolutely. There was a really telling study with veterans. It found that when palliative care consults, or PCCs, happened more than a week before death, family satisfaction was higher.
Okay, more than a week.
But here's the kicker. Satisfaction was significantly higher if that consult happened 6 months earlier.
6 months, wow.
Yeah. It really underscores that bringing palliative support in early isn't giving up. It actually leads to better preparation, better symptom control, more peace for everyone involved.
That idea of preparation flows right into the legal side, the Patient Self-Determination Act, making sure patients have a say even if they can't speak for themselves later.
Exactly. That's where advanced care planning, or ACP, comes in.
Correct.
It results in advanced directives, or ADs.
The AD, that's the written document laying out your wishes, right?
Correct. And it usually has two main parts. First, the durable power of attorney for healthcare, the DPO-AHC.
That's where you name someone to make decisions for you, your healthcare proxy.
Precisely. Your surrogate. And they only step in if the patient loses what we call decisional ability.
Which means they can't understand the information, weigh the options, or communicate a choice.
Exactly. Receive, evaluate, communicate. If they can't do that, the proxy steps in based on the patient's known wishes or best interests.
Yeah, the other part is the living will. That one seems more well-known.
It is. The living will spells out which specific life-sustaining treatments you would or would not want near the end of life. Things like CPR, mechanical ventilation, artificial feeding tubes.
So you're directing your care ahead of time.
You are. It gives you control over what happens to your body.
And connecting the living will right to the bedside action, or inaction, is the Do Not Resuscitate Order, the DNR. Why is that specific order so critical when someone has an end-stage illness?
Because CPR is usually the default, right?
It is the default, and that's the problem in this context. A DNR order signed by a provider is vital because, honestly, CPR is a pretty violent intervention. Yeah, broken ribs, intubation.
Right. It's designed for sudden cardiac arrest in someone who might otherwise recover fully. It wasn't really meant for someone whose body is naturally shutting down from a terminal condition. A DNR respects the patient's wish for a natural end and avoids putting them through something painful and, frankly, often futile in that situation.
Okay, so we have the patient's wishes documented. Now let's look at the physical process those documents anticipate. Thinking about that concept of perfusion, what's happening physiologically as the body starts to shut down?
Well, fundamentally, death occurs when the body's integrated tissue and organ function ceases. Usually this happens because The body's compensatory mechanisms just get overwhelmed by illness or injury. The core mechanism is often the failure of adequate perfusion, getting oxygenated blood to the tissues.
Right, so not enough oxygen delivery.
Yeah.
And that triggers a cascade.
Exactly. Without enough oxygen, cells have to switch to anaerobic metabolism. This produces lactic acid, leading to metabolic acidosis. You also get electrolyte imbalances, like high potassium hyperkalemia. This whole toxic internal environment, plus the direct tissue damage from lack of oxygen, leads to organ failure.
And multiple organs failing leads to.
Multiple organ dysfunction syndrome, or MODS. That's often the final common pathway. MODS ultimately causes the heart to fail, leading to those lethal dysrhythmias or cardiac arrest.
And as clinicians, we see outward signs of this internal process. What are the common things nurses or families might observe first?
You usually see a general slowing down. The patient sleeps much more, becomes weaker, their metabolism decreases, which naturally leads to anorexia, loss of appetite, and reduced fluid intake.
Okay, and that loss of appetite can be really hard for families, right? They want to nurture, to feed.
Oh, definitely. It's a natural instinct. But it's so important to educate them compassionately. We need to reassure them that this anorexia is a normal part of the dying process. The body just doesn't need or want that fuel anymore. Forcing food or fluids can actually cause discomfort or complications.
So the key nursing intervention is?
Never force food or fluids. Instead, focus on comfort. Excellent mouth care is crucial, using moist swabs, lip balm for dry lips. Terminal dehydration usually isn't painful if the mouth is kept comfortable.
What about the circulatory changes? You mentioned poor perfusion. What does that look like?
You'll see the extremities, hands, feet become cool to the touch. They might look mottled, sort of patchy and purplish and maybe cyanotic, which is a bluish tinge. This starts further out and moves inward.
And blood pressure.
Blood pressure drops, often becoming difficult to measure, maybe only palpable. The heart rate might become irregular, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, before it eventually stops.
And the breathing changes. Those can be really distressing to watch.
They really can be. Breathing often becomes shallow and rapid. You might see Cheyne-Stokes respirations.
That classic pattern.
Yeah, where they have periods of no breathing, apnea, alternating with periods of faster, sometimes deeper breathing. And then there's the sound often called the death rattle.
Ugh, yeah, that sounds alarming.
It is. It's a loud, wet-sounding respiration. It happens because secretions pool in the back of the throat, and the patient is too weak to clear them.
What's the best way to manage that for comfort, not just for the family's anxiety, but for the patient?
Positioning is key. Turning the patient onto their side can help the secretions drain. We also use medications, specifically anticholinergics like hyoscyamine or scopolamine. These help to dry up the secretions.
What don't we do?
Critically, we generally avoid deep oropharyngeal suctioning. It rarely reaches the secretions, causing the sound. It can be very uncomfortable, and it often just agitates the patient. Side positioning and meds are the go-to comfort measures. And all these physical changes circle back to that priority, comfort. Assessing symptoms is the first step. We should try to use a consistent scale, like 0 to 10, for intensity whenever possible.
But what about patients who can't communicate verbally anymore? How do you assess their comfort then?
That requires really sharp observation skills. You look for nonverbal cues. Are they restless, grimacing, moaning? Are they guarding a part of their body? And you absolutely have to involve the family. Ask them, what does this behavior usually mean for them? They know the patient best. If they say, he only makes that face when he's in pain, you believe them and treat the pain.
Pain, often the biggest fear. If a patient develops dysphagia, difficulty swallowing, how do we manage their pain meds, especially if they are on long-acting oral opioids?
That's a common challenge. We have to switch routes quickly and effectively. You can't just crush long-acting pills that's dangerous, could lead to overdose. So we move to other non-invasive routes, maybe sublingual liquids, concentrated morphine, or oxycodone under the tongue for faster relief, or transdermal patches like fentanyl for continuous delivery. Rectal suppositories are another option too.
And there's a specific warning about morphine in patients with kidney failure, right?
Yes, a very important drug alert. If a patient has significant renal impairment or becomes anuric, stops making urine, morphine metabolites can build up. These metabolites can actually cause or worsen delirium and neurotoxicity. So in those cases, fentanyl or oxycodone are often safer choices because their metabolites aren't active in the same way. It's a key safety point.
Beyond drugs, what about non-pharmacologic approaches?
Oh, they're crucial. Gentle massage, just light pressure, can be very soothing. Avoid deep pressure if skin is fragile. Guided imagery has good evidence for reducing pain perception. Even simple things like aromatherapy lavender or chamomile can promote relaxation.
Okay, let's talk about breathlessness, dyspnea. That feeling of air hunger can be terrifying.
It really can. And the standard treatment, perhaps surprisingly to some, is often morphine sulfate.
Even if the patient isn't reporting pain.
Yes, morphine works on the brain centers that perceive breathlessness. It reduces that sensation of air hunger, eases anxiety, and can even help with pulmonary congestion a bit. It's very effective.
And there's that interesting action alert about oxygen use that seems counterintuitive.
Right. This is important. We give oxygen based on the patient's subjective feeling of comfort, not just their oxygen saturation number.
So if their SpO2 is 95%,
Mm.
but they feel short of breath, you still give oxygen.
Absolutely. The goal is comfort. If oxygen helps them feel better, we use it. And another simple but often very effective measure is just using an electric fan directed towards their face. The sensation of moving air can significantly reduce the feeling of breathlessness.
Wow, okay, good tip. And lastly, what about agitation or delirium near the end?
First step, always. Look for reversible causes. Is there untreated pain? Are they constipated? Do they have urinary retention? Fix those first. If it looks like true delirium, that acute fluctuating change in mental status, sometimes called terminal delirium, then we think about medications. We need to review their current meds to see if any could be contributing.
And if medication is needed for agitation?
Low-dose haloperidol is often the first choice for managing the psychosis or severe agitation. There's a big caution, though, about using benzodiazepines like lorazepam first line, especially in older adults. They can sometimes cause a paradoxical reaction and actually make the delirium worse.
Okay, haloperidol first. Use benzos cautiously. What if symptoms like pain or delirium just don't respond to anything? The suffering is intractable.
That's when the very difficult option of palliative sedation might be considered.
What exactly is that?
It involves using medications, often benzodiazepines or sometimes propofol, to lower the patient's level of consciousness, specifically to relieve suffering that can't be controlled otherwise.
And how is this different from euthanasia? That feels like a crucial distinction.
It's entirely about intent. With palliative sedation, the sole intention is to relieve unbearable suffering. Death might occur sooner as an indirect consequence, but it's not the goal. With active euthanasia, the specific intention is to cause death. Palliative sedation aims for comfort. Euthanasia aims for death. That ethical line guides everything in end-of-life care. We alleviate suffering, we don't intentionally end life. And that ethical dimension brings us to the psychosocial and spiritual side, which is just as important. We need to talk about grief and mourning.
Right. Grief is the internal feeling, the emotion, while mourning is how that grief is expressed outwardly, socially. How can nurses best support people going through this? What does being with really mean in practice?
Being with is about presence. It's not about having the right words, because often there aren't any. It's about listening actively, acknowledging the immense pain of their loss without trying to fix it or offer platitudes.
So avoiding things like they're in a better place or be strong.
Exactly. Those comments often minimize the griever's reality. Better to just be present, maybe offer a hand on the shoulder, make eye contact, and say something simple like, "This must be incredibly difficult," or just sit in silence with them. Acknowledging the pain is often the most therapeutic thing you can do.
And addressing spiritual needs is vital too. The sources mention the HCME mnemonic for assessment. Can you break that down?
Sure. Hope is a simple tool to guide that conversation gently. H stands for hopes and sources of strength. What gives them hope? What are their support systems? O is for organized religion. Are they part of a formal religious community? Does that play a role? P is for personal spirituality and practices. What beliefs or practices, religious or not, are important to them personally? And E is for the effects on their medical care and end-of-life decisions. How do these beliefs influence what they want or need now?
That seems like a really respectful way to open the door to that conversation.
It is, and it reminds us to be culturally sensitive too. Different cultures have vastly different practices and beliefs around death. We need to ask and accommodate, whether it's specific Islamic bathing rituals, the use of a medicine wheel for indigenous patients, or anything else.
Okay, let's clarify those final complex ethical distinctions. We mentioned active euthanasia is not supported by nursing organizations. What about withdrawing or withholding therapy? Is that ethically different?
Yes, fundamentally different. Withdrawing or withholding life-sustaining treatment, like taking someone off a ventilator or not starting dialysis when it's requested via an advance directive, is considered ethically and legally acceptable.
Why the difference?
Because the cause of death in that situation is the underlying disease process. The withdrawal of treatment simply allows the natural dying process to occur. It's allowing death, not causing it.
Got it. And there's one more option mentioned for competent patients wanting more control over timing.
Right, voluntary stopping of eating and drinking, or VSED. This is when a competent adult with a serious illness makes a conscious decision to stop all food and fluids to hasten their death.
Is that legal? Ethical?
It is generally considered a legal and ethically permissible choice for a competent individual. From a clinical standpoint, it means the palliative care team needs to be highly skilled in managing the symptoms of dehydration and starvation to ensure comfort throughout that process.
Finally, after death occurs, the care doesn't stop. What are the key points for respectful postmortem care?
Utmost respect is paramount. Once death is pronounced, checking for no pulse, no breathing, fixed and dilated pupils, the nurse's role is crucial. You gently prepare the body. Remove tubes and lines, unless there's an autopsy planned. Clean the body, position it naturally. Ensure any specific cultural or religious rituals requested by the family are followed for washing or shrouding. The goal is to present the person with dignity for family viewing or transport. It's that final act of care.
This has been incredibly insightful, covering so much ground, from the legal frameworks to the bedside care and the deep ethical questions. If you had to boil it all down, what's the absolute core message for someone learning about end-of-life care?
I'd say it's twofold. First, you need technical skill, really understanding complex symptom management, like knowing why you use morphine for dyspnea or the specific risks of opioids and renal failure. But just as important, you need ethical grounding and compassion, ensuring patient autonomy through things like advanced directives and DNRs, and providing that holistic comfort that addresses physical, emotional, and spiritual needs. It's about combining science with profound humanity.
That's powerful. And maybe here's a final thought for you, our listeners, to take away from this deep dive. Consider that fine but critical line between palliative sedation, where the intent is purely comfort, and active euthanasia, where the intent is death. How does holding that distinction clearly in mind shape every single decision, every interaction, every moment of care at the end of life? How does it help ensure we honor dignity right to the very end?
Thank you for exploring this vital topic with us today.